Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. On my YouTube channel, full of more than 600 videos about Norse language, myth, runes, Vikings, etc., and supported by my generous community of Patreon donors, I try to answer the questions that I get from the public about these topics as much as I can. And one that has come up surprisingly often without me addressing it in a video specifically is about some spelling differences between names where you see sometimes an I and sometimes an E. So the most common examples of this that you'll see out there are the god's name usually spelled as Loki, L-O-K-I, but sometimes you'll see Loke, L-O-K-E, and then Odin, usually anglicized O-D-I-N, but sometimes you'll see O-D-E-N. So there's really, I think, two principal things that cause this variation. I'm going to talk about what I think is probably what's usually going on, and then I'm going to talk about another possibility for what's going on with these spelling differences. So as far as what's probably usually going on, I think that typically this is Swedish writers or Swedish influenced writers who are writing with these E endings. Of course, it could also be Norwegian and Danish writers or Norwegian and Danish influenced writers. In all of these languages on the continent, with a few exceptions in Swedish that don't matter here, an unstressed vowel written as I in Standard Old Norse becomes what's typically realized as a schwa vowel and written as an E. So you see this all over the whole language. With any place where Old Norse has an unstressed I, you're going to see an E in these other languages. So for example, guests in Old Norse, gestir, with that unstressed I, but in modern Norwegian or Swedish, it's pronounced roughly yester, and you've got that unstressed E pronounced more or less as a schwa. A lot of dialectal variation there, though. So I think that for the most part, it's a case of people seeing the modern Scandinavian writings or spellings from Norway, Sweden, or Denmark, and then just assuming that that is the spelling that applies in Old Norse too, which is, not a ridiculous assumption, but it's actually not how these names are spelled in Old Norse. In fact, although Loki is spelled identically to how we typically see it in English and Old Norse, Odin is spelled long O, special letter eth, often transliterated as D, but actually stands for a TH sound, I-N-N. And then you have names like Thor that are spelled differently than one might expect because Thor uses the special letter thorn that stands for the th sound in think. All right, so I think that typically what's going on is that it's modern Scandinavian influence on the continent. Let me give you a quick word from my friends and partners at Grimfrost. I'll come back and tell you about another thing that could be going on too. Another thing that could be going on that only requires Old Norse influence without the intermediation of one of the modern Scandinavian languages on the continent is that Old Norse spelling of basically everything varies. There's no dictionary of Old Norse during Old Norse times to which writers of Old Norse can refer. Instead, probably you're mostly talking about clerics or people who learn to write from clerics who probably read and write Latin and have some of the basic principles of how medieval Latin is spelled, and then some basic principles for how Old Norse is spelled, and then basically just spell words as they sound to them based on those principles. It's a little bit like, let's say that I make up a word, and I hope this bears no relation to any real word, but say that I tell you that this is a Coddly great view. Okay, you've never heard this coddly. Seems to mean something like, splendidly or something. And you're perhaps transcribing something that I'm writing in a letter, you're taking dictation from me, never heard this word. Well, how are you going to spell it to represent how it kind of sounds to you just using the basic principles of English? Well, there's probably dozens of possibilities between C and K, between O and AU for the first vowel, between T or D or double D for the next consonant. There's just a ton of possibilities here. But I could probably look at any particular spelling that you would choose based on those general principles of how English is spelled and read out what I had said. Old Norse is spelled basically like that. So there's little bits of variation that are going to come in between different manuscripts and even different pages of the same manuscript and even different lines on the same manuscript page where the same word is going to be spelled multiple different ways. And like in English, most of the uncertainty in the sort of general spelling principles revolves around vowels, right? There's always going to be a lot of individual variation. There's going to be regional variation and then variation over time between how people say vowels. Consider the cot merger, which is pretty complete in a lot of American English. With younger people, this is a merger that I have. For example, I say a cot that you sleep on and I caught a ball. They sound the same. Most older speakers, older than, well, it depends on where. In a lot of the South, this merger hasn't happened. Won't have this merger. So one of these real points of uncertainty, especially in early Old Norse, is how to write unstressed vowels. Old Norse has 3 unstressed vowels. In standard Old Norse, right, the Old Norse that you're going to see in a textbook or in an edition of a saga or something, or in a book like my Wanderer's Havamal, those 3 unstressed vowels are going to be written I, U, and A. That's also how they're written today in modern Icelandic and Faroese. But some writers apparently hear that unstressed I-like vowel as more like an E, and some writers apparently hear that unstressed U-like vowel is more like an O. So you will find Old Norse manuscripts, particularly older ones from Iceland or, all over Sweden, as this was actually fairly standard in Old Swedish writing, where you do see, for example, Loke, L-O-K-A, not L-O-K-I. Or you'll potentially see, although it's less common in front of nasals, like N and M, long O, Ev, E, and N. I don't think I've ever seen that specifically in Old Norse, but I've definitely seen L-O-K-E. Or L-O-C-E, because, again, they're basing this on Latin principles and they often use C instead of K. So possibly it's that, someone seeing an older edition where someone is perhaps following manuscript spellings, or perhaps trying to imitate those older spellings on the theory that they're sort of older and more genuine. I don't think there's actually a good case for that, because it seems like speakers probably just kind of couldn't decide what these unstressed vowels sounded more like, an E or an I or an O or a U. And of course in modern Swedish, by the way, you'll notice that the unstressed 3 vowels are spelled E-O-A, and those do correspond to Classical Old Norse I-U-A, because Swedish picked the other set than Icelandic picked. But typically in Old Norse editions today, we follow Icelandic principles, which makes sense. Most of the texts are from Iceland, and we spell those unstressed vowels I-U-A. All right. Well, this may be a long answer to a short question, but I hope that helps clear that up a little bit. And from beautiful Colorado, let me wish you